everyone, and welcome to the May Bird-Friendly Communities Lunch and Learn. We're really happy to have you joining us today. This month, we're going to talk about native plants, but before we get to that, I want to brief you a few logistics just so that everybody can have a great webinar together. There are two ways you may be joining us today, either through Zoom or Facebook, and we look forward to answering any questions that you may have at the end of the presentation. But you can begin to submit those at any point during the presentation. I'll be monitoring those throughout. If you are joining us through Zoom, you can add those to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if you're joining us on Facebook, questions can be added directly to the comment section. And again, I'll monitor those throughout the presentation, and once we finish, then we'll get to answering as many of those as possible. This program is being recorded, and it will be available for viewing immediately following the presentation on our Facebook page, but we'll also get the video uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if you've missed any of the previous Bird Friendly Communities Lunch and Learns and you'd like to view those, you can see those through the Michigan Audubon YouTube channel or through our Facebook page. So if you're watching a recording of this, or if you have questions at a later time, you can also send those to us at the Michigan Audubon general email address at birds@michiganaudubon.org. We love questions, so we hope you have lots of those ready for us now and later. But without further ado, I would like to get to our topic, native plants. Native plants are crucial for birds, as well as other pollinators and wildlife. But today we're really lucky to have Carolyn Miller joining us to discuss native plants. Carolyn is a horticulturist and botanist, and she serves as the current president of the Michigan Wildflower Association of Michigan, or the Wildflower Association of Michigan. I always say that wrong, sorry. She's also an avid birder and bird lover, so we're really lucky to have her with us today. So thank you, Carolyn, and with that, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Well, welcome all. When Lindsay approached me to do this, you could say, it's always tough because I am a plant nerd at heart, but I've been birding since I was probably 10 years old, throughout the state of Michigan, and now my wife and I tend to go elsewhere to bird as well. We just spent the entire month of April down in Grand Isle, Louisiana, watching all the spring migrants make their way back, and it was exciting to watch what the birds do down there in regards to feeding and what native plants are they feeding on. And a lot of them are the same up here. And so I'm going to focus this talk on birds and pollinators, because in reality, if we don't have insects, there's a lot, especially our spring birds that migrate through. If we don't have insects, we're not going to have the spring migrants. So I decided to call it, what do pollinators and birds need? Well, it starts with native plants. So just a few things, background information. What is native? Well, native plants were found in this country before European settlement. And these plants developed over hundreds and thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. You can think of the boreal forests. We've got remnants that come down into way upper Michigan and Isle Royal. They have been there for millennia. And why do we plant with native plants? Native plants support native insects, and all plants are not created equal in their ability to support food webs. Think about invasive plants. You can walk up to a buckthorn, up to privet, and you will hardly ever see native insects on those plants. Now, you can think about autumn olive and Russian olive and think, oh, well, the birds eat those. Yes, and it's not good for them either. The food source in that plant is absolutely useless for birds. It's as if they're getting, this big dose of sugar, and if you give a toddler candy, what happens? They get all ramped up and then they crash. And the same goes for the birds. It's the same scenario. They eat all the bad stuff and they lose their energy. So, and also insects and plants evolve together. Our classic example, monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies look for milkweeds, and that is their host plant. That is the only plant that monarchs will lay their eggs on. Now, are there plants that mimic milkweed? Yes, black swallowwort. And I'm sure everybody's heard about the black swallowwort, because it's in the same family as our milkweeds, same exact family. And monarchs will lay their eggs on the black swallowwort. They live for just a little bit and then they die, and then that's it. So, that was one of those plants that monarchs did not evolve with. They evolved with milkweed, but they can't recognize milkweed from black swallowwort because it's in the same family. And ultimately, it's the food chain. So plants feed insects, insects feed our insectivorous birds, and then those birds might feed a snake, they might feed a Cooper's hawk, a sharp-shinned hawk, and then somebody further up the chain, food chain after that. So that's what we have to think about. Native plants is where we need to start in order to keep our native birds alive and healthy, so to speak. So, and insects are specialized. 99% of the insects that eat plants can develop and reproduce only on the native plants with which they share an evolutionary history with. Monarchs and milkweeds. And there's plenty of other examples. Our swallowtail butterflies, they like sassafras, spicebush, pawpaw. We've got a hackberry. What is it? There's a hackberry butterfly, and I'm drawing the blank, but it needs hackberry trees. Celtis occidentalis. So they evolve together, and that's why we have to help them. So bottom line, if you plant it, they will eat. And this just happens to be a picture of my yard. So I'm in urban Lansing. And when my wife and I bought our little house, we had just a small yard. I took out all the turf. There is absolutely no turf grass in my yard at all. And I put in native plants, and it was trial and error with a lot of these native plants because not everybody plays nicely. So if it didn't play nicely, then I sort of took it out. And I also put in, there's talk about the nativars, which are cultivars of native plants. Not all of them are bad. But I will say, if you're going to use nativars, because sometimes they are more well-behaved, then stick with the same foliage color and the same flower color, and don't do double flowers. Like there's some echinaceas, coneflowers that are double flowered. There's absolutely nothing to that an insect can get to the pollen whatsoever, because it's really just, it has overshadowed what we need to have. So just keep that in mind. So food for thought, so to speak. So native plants for butterflies, insects, and birds. So we need to supply food throughout the entire year. So that means spring, summer, fall, and even into winter. And we can always help, we can help our winter birds by putting out suet and various bird feeders with bird seed. We can always do that. But, for our pollinators and our insects, we definitely have to have things spring, summer, and fall. And that can include conifers and grasses, legumes. One of our most common legumes, of course, in Michigan is our wild lupin, although I'm probably never going to have a crown or blue butterfly in my Lansing yard, and it doesn't seem to do very well. So therefore, I don't have any lupin in my yard. Nectar producers, summer fruits, fall fruits, winter fruits. You can think acorns and beech trees. So the beech nuts, which actually, squirrels eat right and left. And even birds, a lot of woodpeckers, they'll pick them off and, peck them open and eat them. And along with acorns and nuts, and of course, our feeders in the winter time to help that. So conifers, white pine, for example, there are seeds, there's definitely seeds with pine, and majority, you're going to get some woodpeckers that will feed on those. You'll also get squirrels. However, it's the insects that use pine as a food source. And I've been able to, especially being up north in the UP, I've been able to watch so many bird species just flit around the needle clusters, picking off the insects. And then eastern red cedar, those big berries, they don't call them cedar waxwings for nothing. So cedar waxwings absolutely love these cedar berries. I've also watched nuthatches kind of get to them, sometimes the chickadees. But again, it's a food source, especially late summer into fall, and sometimes the berries are left over in the winter time. But again, conifers offer a food source. Grasses. So why grasses? Seeds. These have fantastic seed heads, and a lot of these are important to migrating sparrows. And there are also butterfly and moth species that use their host plant are types of grasses. And for quite a few skippers, actually, skipper butterflies actually use grasses as their host plant. And also, when grasses flop over in the fall and into the winter, they get covered with snow. But a lot of insects will nest under there, and that's where they'll hibernate. So, a lot of chrysalids and moth cocoons, that's where they're hiding for the winter time. So, that there's that saying, don't cut your stuff down until it really starts to warm up, maybe the middle of May. And that's the reason why, because if we start to rake that up, that's where all those, that's where they're hibernating, that's where they're hanging out. And so let it get nice and warm. Now this week, I cut a lot of things down, but I just let it sit there for a while. And then I just recently started to pick things up. I left some stems on the ground so that a lot of them still have, places to hide. But grasses are an excellent source of seed for our migrating sparrows. Early nectar plants, my favorite time of year. So I've watched migrating hummingbirds feeding off of columbine. It's an early nectar source. And columbine is one of those early spring flowers that provides nutrition to hummingbirds. And it also provides, bees get to it as well. But in regards to the birds, this is a big one for hummingbirds. It's red. That's what hummingbirds are attracted to. And they'll get right up underneath that columbine and sip out the nectar. Meanwhile, getting pollen on their forehead and hitting the next columbine flower to pollinate. Early pollinator plants for pollinators, prairie smoke, GM triflorum, and Dutchman's breeches, Dicentra cucularia. So it's really interesting because the queen bumblebee emerges in the springtime and she's hungry. So these two plants bloom very early in the spring, and they're actually buzz pollinated. So bumblebees can vibrate, they vibrate their wings, and it's this kind of low frequency. Well, that shakes the pollen loose, so they can gather the pollen that that they're going to use for their brood nests, because that's what she's all about. And then they move on to the next Dutchman's breeches, and they pollinate that. But excellent plant to put in, have in your yards. Dutchman's breeches prefers it a little bit shadier, whereas prairie smoke can be right out in the open. I've got the prairie smoke in my yard, bakes in the sun every day and does extremely well. And it's starting to get, we see this and everybody thinks, oh, well, it's not that pretty. Well, wait till it starts to seed and it's all big fluff. And mine, it's just starting to get to that fluffy stage. Summer plants, there we have our native Lanissera, Lincera sempervirens, and Cardinal flower, Lobelia Cardinalis. Both have nice long bloom periods, and they provide nectar to hummingbirds as well as insects. And I don't see the Cardinal flower hit by too many pollinators, but I do see our native honeysuckle get hit by the pollinators on the end and get coated with pollen as they reach down in there, and they get their nectar and they get their pollen, and so that's an excellent plant to have around. I haven't grown any of the Lincera yet, but I need to do that. So remember, this is the native Lincera, not the evil one that's all over the place. Other summer nectar plants are swamp milkweed, Sclepius incarnata, and our purple prairie clover, which is Dahlia purpurea. And on the swamp milkweed, that's a solitary wasps, female. They're big and they're scary. However, we've got to remember that this is what birds are eating. They're eating the insects. So if you plant it, they will visit. And therefore, you're bringing in the birds as well, because the bird's going to look at your neighbor who's got the turf grass and then see your yard that has all these native plants that's buzzing with activity of pollinators and just other insects, and it's a food source. And on the Dahlia purpurea, you can just barely make out that tiny little mason bee. But again, these solitary bees are gathering nectar and gathering pollen, therefore reproducing, giving us more, and it's a food source for our birds. And these two do pretty well too in my yard. So I've kept these guys, they behave well. Now, if we look at summer fruits and flowers, serviceberry, amelanchier. If you've got room to put one of these in, I would put it in a heartbeat. It blooms early, and I don't know if you know the reason why they call it serviceberry, but they call it serviceberry because back in Western days, so to speak, the olden days, when the ground was soft enough that the people could bury their dead that had died over the winter, and they simply kept them cold. Once the serviceberry bloomed, they knew that the ground was soft enough to have their funeral service, and that's how the name serviceberry came up. But it's supposed to have excellent fruits that we can try to eat, but usually there's a lot of birds that get to it beforehand. Robins, cedar waxwings are just a few to name. But again, excellent food source for the birds. Black cherry, the same thing with black cherry, offers, flowers for insects, and later in the summer, berries for the birds. So two, excellent choices, of trees. Serviceberry doesn't get that big. Black cherry, of course, can get quite tall and has that prized, beautiful wood. So another reason to put one of those in. More summer fruits and flowers. Elderberry, Sambucus canadensis. We saw these all over down in Louisiana, and they were just starting to flower. So I could only imagine what, if it's not picked by humans to make, elderberry syrup or elderberry jam, that once the birds begin to migrate back down, back south again, I'm sure it's just a feast. Beautyberry, Calicarpa americana. We've got some planted I work for Michigan State University with the Beale Botanical Garden and then the campus arboretum, which is the entire campus. And we have beautyberry, and I can watch the robins just scarf those berries off, as well as, as other migrating birds. And they're both, especially the beautyberry, it's very high in sugar and good carbohydrates, which it's fuel. It's good fuel. It's not just straight up sugar, like honeysuckles are and autumn olive is, but it's complex carbohydrates, which, it keeps fuel going without, having the birds come crashing down because of a sugar low. Then we have our summer flowers for pollinators. Mountain mint, Pycanthemum virginianum. A lot of mints tend to spread. That's just the nature of the beast. Mountain mint is kind of a slow spreader, but if you've got it's an excellent pollinator plant. Here's a bumblebee. Bumblebees are all over it. A lot of the solitary wasps are all over it. Smaller bee, mason bees, smaller bees are all over that. And it tends to stay on a clumpy, it's a slow spreader. It's not like spearmint, which can just take off, but it's a little bit more compact. Bee balm, on the other hand, I've never had a problem with deep bee balm. It tends to stay, nice and compact, doesn't spread, doesn't spread too quickly. And if it does, then I just, I simply yank up the seedlings that I don't, I want to keep it where it is, and I'll just pluck the seeds. And again, bee balm, it's a long tubular flower, so it's great for I hear swallowtail butterflies, the monarchs will hit it. Also, some of the bumblebees will get to it, but and hummingbirds. I watch my hummingbirds they absolutely love this one, and they'll just tackle it away and have fun with it. But again, bee balm is one of those specialized flowers because it's more tubular than your mountain mint, which is really it's still tubular, but it's not it's not a deep tubular flower. Here's some more classic summer flowers for pollinators. Purple coneflower provides pollen for pollinators, and in the fall, seeds. Oh my gosh. And my goldfinches will just pick that, they'll start plucking as soon as they think it's ready, when it's not nearly ready. But the goldfinches will hit it, the chickadees will hit it. I've had nuthatches land on it. Milkweeds, we all know, are the monarch host plant. Common milkweed can be a bit aggressive, so I recommend swamp milkweed or butterfly milkweed for a more controlled plant. And if you have the property to put common milkweed on, there's been a study that in mid-June is to trim that plant back by half, because monarch butterflies are looking for those fresh leaves. If the milkweed gets too tall, those leaves are really tough, and it's actually pretty hard for the caterpillars to bite into. But if it's those fresh new growth leaves, it's better off. It's much better for the larvae. And with fresher growth, there's less predation on the caterpillar larvae. The older the plant, for some reason it attracts, you'll see aphids. Aphids will then bring in other insects, that will parasitize aphids, assassin bugs. I can't tell you how many assassin bugs I've seen in the last couple summers that, they're attracted to those aphids and those other ants, so they hang out there. But if you cut that plant in half, and then even in August, maybe, and then trim that new growth, not on all of them, but a few of the plants, you're offering fresh leaves, fresh growth for those larvae that the female monarch will find. But I haven't tried cutting back on the butterfly weed or the swamp milkweed. So it's something I gotta try that. Fall fruits and flowers, spice bush. Unfortunately, I did not have a photo of the fruits, because usually they're already gone. But they're high in protein and high in fat. And dogwoods are the same thing. Different types of dogwoods like Cornus alternifolia, Cornus amonymum, and Cornus florida. High fat content in the seeds, and with that pulp, and that's what the bird needs to sustain itself on its migratory flight. And especially with dogwoods, especially with like gray dogwood, red dogwood, opposite dogwood, that those flowers are, those are pretty big. With a lot of wasps prefer those flower heads. And so again, it's feeding two different things. You're feeding the insects, which then feed the birds, and of course then the birds are eating the berries. Fall flowers for pollinators, late fall asters and goldenrod. The combination, it's a knockout for fall. These provide pollen and nectar and later seeds for bees and butterflies. And with the two of these, especially in the fall, you can't go wrong. If you've got room for goldenrods, and there's so many different species out there that, if you can grow some of those, you're going to have insects all over it. And consequently, insects on the goldenrod and insects on the New England aster are then getting picked off by the migrating birds, which I've watched in my little tiny urban yard. If you have a smaller yard, which I do, there's goldenrods I would absolutely love to grow, but I also know that they get too big. So as for some smaller goldenrods, Solidago nemuralis, which is called Oldfield Goldenrod, or I knew it as gray goldenrod, stays about 2 feet at 2 feet in height at max, is a very slow spreader, and I absolutely love it as it stays nice and short, and grows in hot, sunny and sunny places. Solidago flexicalis, which is zigzag goldenrod, and Solidago caesia, blue stem goldenrod, are great for shady areas. And yes, pollinators will visit shade, and if you plant it, they will visit you. But there's lots of asters and solidagos that bloom. There's an early solidago. Again, it gets a little too big for my yard, so I stick to the short guys. And plenty of asters that are shorter than New England aster, because I've seen some pretty tall New England asters. But again, with New England aster, I will cut it back, and sometimes I cut it back almost at least twice in a summer, and so it blooms a little later. But it's more of a short, compact plant, and that's why I like it. But only, I love the plant, but I have to cut it back so that it has that shorter stature in my yard. Other fall flowers, the Prairie Dock was a Silphium terebinthaceum and turtlehead Chelone glabra. So it's interesting with the turtlehead, bumblebees are about the only thing that can get in there because they have to pry it open, and bumblebees are pretty beefy, and so they're able to get in there. All the Silphium species, this is one of my favorites. Yes, it gets tall. However, the leaves maybe only get 2 to 3 feet high, and then that's it. And the leaves are impressive, which is probably why I love it. And then just the flower, the flower head can go up 6, 7 feet. And I usually have to stake up the flower heads because they tend to just bend over. But the goldfinches and the chickadees absolutely love this plant. And it doesn't seem to seed very well, because I think actually the majority of the birds actually get to it before I get to it. And, because it's just absolutely picked clean. Turtlehead, the Chelone, doesn't get too tall, maybe 2 to 3 feet, just sort of depending. I do have it in my yard. I put in a rain garden, so that kind of sits on the edge of the rain garden and does very well. And it's so much fun to watch the bumblebees just pry that, they pry that flower open, and then they get themselves in there, and you can hear them buzzing because, again, they're trying to shake loose that pollen. So that's what they're doing. But, it's a great plant to have. Trees. Doug Tallamy from, Bringing Nature Home, and I know he just wrote a book about oaks. There's not a better tree you can plant than a Quercus alba, a white oak, as it's known to support over 400 species of insects. And while I was down in Louisiana, of course, they have the live oaks, and which is Quercus virginica. And that's where all the warblers were hanging out. We're on these live oaks, just moving up and down the trunks, up and down the branches. It was flowering at the time, so they're constantly picking around around the flowers to get all the insects. There's just, there's not a better tree you can plant. I love the red oaks. However, red oaks are much more susceptible to oak wilt, and whereas white oaks, they can get it and they will get it, but they seem to combat it, whereas red oaks, not so much. And with red oaks, if you've got a grove of red oaks, the roots tend to graft together. So they'll exchange whatever, And so if one red oak gets oak wilt, it will exchange it with everybody else if its roots have grafted onto each other with the surrounding red oaks. So I don't think we've come out with a oak wilt resistant red oak yet, but hopefully, in the future we will, because, they're one of those iconic trees in Michigan, and we're kind of losing the battle on some places. But you can put a white oak in and you will feed birds for life, even beyond life. More trees, red maple, Acer rubrum is one of the, of silver maple, red maple, and sugar maple. Put a red maple in. So red maples are insect pollinated. Sugar maples can go back and forth. They can go wind and they can go insect. It just depends. Silver maples are pretty much strictly wind pollinated. So if you want to put a maple in, put a red maple in. They bloom early. There's plenty of pollen source for insects to eat. And again, they bloom early. So the insects are feeding and the birds are migrating. Therefore, they're feeding on those insects. Willows are another fantastic pollinator plant to bring in pollinators. And, and the same thing applies. Bring in the pollinators, you bring in those insects in, the birds are feeding. McGee Marsh, I'm sure many of you have heard about McGee Marsh down in Ohio. There's the boardwalk through the marsh. A lot of the trees in that area are willows. Where are they hopping around? That's where all the warblers are, because they're feeding on all the insects that are all around those willows. Yes, the fluff gets annoying when it's done, but again, if it seeds itself, all you got to do is just pluck those little seedlings up. But in the end, we're feeding our pollinators, which are feeding our birds. And there's Prairie Willow, which doesn't get too tall. Our pussy willows, same thing. They don't get to the size of a black willow. And with most of those, you can actually trim them back so that you can keep a nice gentle size versus a very, very large tree, but rather keep them more shrub-like. More trees. So while I was in Louisiana, the hotbed tree was, of course, the live oak, which is on the right with the indigo buntings. And on the left, it was Morris rubra, Red Mulberry. This was a favorite of indigo buntings, painted buntings, evening grosbeaks, orchard orioles, the catbirds, wood thrush, Swainson's thrush. They were all feeding on these berries. So Morris rubra is native to the United States. Morris alba is the white mulberry. That's the not so nice one because it tends to really, it can get on the invasive side, as it will just take over, especially disturbed areas. It will just take over. But again, it's the food source. So you want insects, you want birds, plant an oak tree. That's really where it comes down to, because all the birds were just feeding all, both of these species of trees. This is what they were all on. And we have shrubbery. So all of these shrubs provide food for either birds and or pollinators. High bush cranberry, the flowers, typically a lot of, I see a lot of solitary wasps on these. But then the fruit is excellent food source for migrating birds. Shrubby cinquefoil, I've seen all kinds of pollinators sitting on that. I really haven't seen a lot of bird activity, but again, if there's insects, they might have been picking off the insects. But these are kind of, and then New Jersey tea, Ceonyrthus americanus, again, great for pollinators, bringing in the birds, bringing in the insects. So all three of them are an excellent source. All three can be, if you've got a small yard, all three can be manageable. You can definitely keep them small by simply, trimming them back and, keeping them to the short stature that you would like in your yard. I have a couple high bush cranberries that I just, every fall, I just whack them back and they sprout, sprout again right in the springtime. So they're all pushing up pretty nice right now. They're probably slowing down a bit with the cool weather, but they'll regain themselves pretty quick. I think by next week. So in urban landscapes, I have to keep it short and short and neat. So, and this was, there was a lot of trial and error with this because when I first started out, I wanted every native plant I could possibly plant in the yard. And then you learn a few things. So not everybody plays well with everybody else. And so, I'm just going to list a few of my favorites that have done extremely well with my urban yard, and they play well with others. Some of these I will actually especially Coreopsis, once I can, they're done flowering and they're getting ready to make seed, they're swelling up, they're making seed. I'll just go ahead and I will trim all those heads off, just because, Coreopsis can seed all over the place. And I don't want a whole lot of plants. So I just go in, pluck a few here and there, like I said, I do a lot of deadheading, but, the notion of, oh, well, you put native plants in and you leave it alone. That's not the notion. You have to take care of it. Just like just as if you had a large perennial garden with all these perennials, you don't just leave it alone because you're going to, you have to weed it. No, I don't water anything, and I don't fertilize anything, but I do go in and deadhead so that I don't have to do so much work later on. But Coreopsis lanceolata, sand Coreopsis, Penstemon hirsutus, beard tongue, Penstemon digitalis, Penstemon, Iris virginica, southern blue flag iris. All four of those have done very well in my yard. And I've actually added a couple different species of Penstemon, some from out west, just because, some of them are a little bit shorter, a little bit different color. One of them I have, and I'm blanking on the species, but it's great for hummingbirds because they've come to it because it's a red color. So that's what makes it fun. So, I like to experiment with a few other native plants from, other areas, other regions of the country. And so, they've all worked out so far. Other plants that stay on the short side, bee balm, like I mentioned, Monarda fistulosa, tends to stay in a nice little clump. Cardinal flower, Lobelia cardinalis, sits in my rain garden area. And again, perfect for the hummingbirds, which, they frequent the front yard repeatedly. Butterfly weed, Sclepius tuberosa. If you want a milkweed, this guy, he stays short, doesn't spread. And again, I will snip the pods off just so that I don't have, sometimes I don't think my neighbors want milkweed like I do. So I just, I keep it trimmed. Nodding onion, Allium cernum. I love the nodding onions. They are a pollinator magnet. Everything is on them. They will seed quite readily. So again, this is one of those plants that I will deadhead. Once it's done flowering, I just go start to snip the heads off so that I can stop it from really taking over, because if it had its chance, it would take over. But it's a good plant. Other ones, I put in pasque-flower, anemone patens. This guy blooms early and is full of pollen. I've seen some queen bumblebees because they emerge, they come out first, and they are all over that pollen. Harebell, Campanula rotundiflora is, I have, if you've got maybe a little bit of a rock garden, perfect plant for it. It likes it because you typically will find this in rocky substrate. So it's the perfect plant. It's very dainty. I've seen the bees, the pollinators that I see are usually small mason bees or sweat bees. Those are the ones that typically go to the harebell because it's small enough and, they don't have to fight with the bumblebee for it. So this, that plant's done very well, but the pasque flower is just absolutely stunning this year. And bumblebees all over it. Those queens are pretty doggone happy with, last year I didn't think the plant was going to make it. This year it's making it. So, and the seed heads look just like prairie smoke. They're absolutely beautiful. So you kind of you get the gorgeous flowers and then you get the really cool seed heads. Couple other things that make a great, and actually prairie smoke makes a great ground cover. It's a slow spreader, but makes a great ground cover. It slowly, covers up the ground, which is actually really good. Pussy toes, Antonaria neglecta, can form a really nice short layer, because it's only about 2 inches tall tops. It'll put up its flower stalk, which might be about 6 inches tall, and they get off, nice and fuzzy. It's an aster, and but it's the host plant for the lady queen, but I'm thinking that's wrong. American painted lady. And last year I actually did see a female laying eggs. I never saw any caterpillars, so could be something else got to it. Not sure. Hoping they'll come back this year. Pen sedge, Carex pennsylvanica. Some butterflies and moths use sedges as a host plant. Also, just like grasses, this forms a great ground cover and spreads slowly. And absolutely, I love it. So if you don't want to deal with weeds, put in Carex pennsylvanica. It does what it needs to do. So you might think, well, where do I find native plants? So there are numerous nurseries around the state. Of course, mid-Michigan, we have wild type. If you're down in Kalamazoo area, there's hidden savanna. Designs by Nature. I know that Vern Stevens now he's got his mid-Michigan up in Langsburg nursery. He now has one on the east side of the state, the west side of the state, and northern Michigan. So he's expanding into those regions. And then what goes along, a lot of these places, I'm going to pop ahead just a few, but conservation districts. A lot of conservation districts have plant sales. Also, there's mail order plants, Prairie Moon Nursery and Prairie Nursery. One of them's in Wisconsin, the other one's in Minnesota. So, it may not be Michigan genotype, but those plants, they are here in Michigan. So I have used to get a few plants that I haven't been able to get, elsewhere. So I have used one of those nurseries. Organizations such as Wild Ones, a lot of the Wild Ones throughout the state have plant sales that are getting ready to start. So look into those, and maybe your neighbors have some. So that's always another source to check out. And, if you can get a neighbor to do what you're doing, then you can swap plants. So that's kind of the nice thing about it. And so, the image on the left was the start of my transformation on the front yard. I keep the short plants in the front and then the tall plants in the back. And every year I have gained at least one new butterfly species. So last year I actually gained 2, and I'm in an urban environment. I am completely in the city of Lansing, and it's exciting to watch this. This year, I'm going to challenge myself and try to identify as many of the bees as possible, which could probably take some time. But if I can get a genus, I'll be thrilled. With iNaturalist, I can pretty much take pictures and submit and probably get a positive ID. And you know, maybe you'll see my article somewhere on bees in an urban environment. But that's all I have. So thank you very much. If we could all be outside talking plants, I would just be, I'm a geek at heart. But if you have any questions, Lindsay will ask me. But I thank you for the time.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carolyn.
You're welcome.
I know I definitely was like writing notes down, so I hope you guys all learned something too. We are at 45 minutes, so if you have to leave, I understand, but we will stick around for a few more minutes to answer some questions that you may have. Again, you could submit those to the Q&A box on Zoom or through the comment section on Facebook. So we did have one question, and I was trying to catch where this was, but I didn't. So someone was asking if you could spell out those summer nectar plants. So I think it was one of the first ones you said. It wasn't written on the screen.
Oh, I bet it was.
But I was trying to figure out where it was, but I missed the question.
I think I know what it was. I think I know which one it was.
Okay.
In fact, I forgot to put the name on
That's
there.
okay.
And it's probably that one. So the native honeysuckle is Lanissera sempervirens, Sempervirens. And then the red one is cardinal flower, Lobelia Cardinalis.
Beautiful.
And I know that wild type has the native honeysuckle.
All right, so we have another question about any special thoughts for the Upper Peninsula.
So a lot of these can definitely grow in the UP. And I know that there is Designs by Nature. I want to say I know that he's collecting seed in the UP, so that has that genotype of, the Upper Peninsula, different, definitely gets a little colder. But a lot of these, their zone of growth tends to be from 4 to 6, 4 to 7. And the UP would more than likely, it's going to fit in that zone 4, probably zone 3 for some of these. And actually look at the nurseries, the 2 nurseries that I had mentioned, Prairie Moon Nursery and Prairie Nursery, because one's in Minnesota, the other one is in Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin. So those are probably going to be really. And again, if you look in those in his catalogs or online, a lot of those plants are here in Michigan as well.
Perfect. So someone also mentioned that extra seeds are accepted by some local public libraries, and they're wondering if you've ever done that.
I have not, but that is a good idea.
Yeah, I just saw that Capital Area District Libraries just shared something about vegetable seeds in their library of things. So that's a really great idea.
That is a good idea. I may have a new project.
Yeah, there you go. So I do want to also mention to everyone that there are more resources available about native plants, including a lot of those nurseries that Carolyn mentioned on the Michigan Audubon website. So if you go to michiganaudubon.org, there's a whole native plant section. There are also some native garden design booklets available that you can download. So if you're not really sure where to get started, that's a really great place. I know it can be really overwhelming. I am in the process of trying to put in native plants in my own yard. Just recently bought a house, and for some reason, it's very normal to landscape with non-natives. So
Yeah,
I'm in the process of removing and replanting. And it is a little overwhelming, but we can all make a big difference just by doing a few things. A little bit at a time really helps. And I think Carolyn did a really great job of explaining to us. She had a lot of trial and error and still is trial and error.
Still trial and error.
So it's something to just keep in mind, and you know, just keep at it. Every little bit really helps for our birds and our pollinators. So that's all the questions we have at the moment. If you have other questions, again, you can submit those to us through our Facebook page or at birds@michiganaudubon.org. Next month, we're actually going to be covering invasive plant species. So
another good one.
Yeah, so that'll go nicely with all of this. So hopefully you guys are able to join us. And again, if you want to watch this again, or if you want to catch any of the lunch and learns that we've had previously, you can see those through our Facebook page and through our YouTube channel. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Carolyn.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, everyone.